Good afternoon. Welcome to week 3, Sociology of Crime, CCJ 2007 or OUA 27 or OUA CJ 27. Week 3, we're looking at classical criminology and social logics of punishment. So this week we'll have 3 shorter lectures. The first part we're looking at today, which is in red, include what are theories of crime, theory formulation, as well as crime paradigms. The next part we'll look at in blue, classical criminology and criticisms. And the final lecture for this week, we'll look at social logics of punishment. Let's go ahead and get started. So in this lecture, we're going to move to looking at theories of crime causation. A major part of this course is what we do in this sense. We look at research and existing theories of crime from a variety of sociological as well as other perspectives or sociological critiques of those perspectives. This is the most common pursuit of criminologists, as they seek not only to describe causality or correlation, but to explain these as well. Right? This goes all the way back to Sutherland and Cressy's definition from week 1. The point is not merely to describe, but to explain. Theory in this regard is understood as an explanation of cause and effect supported by empirical evidence. So we can think of 2 types of theories. The bog standard that you would have learned early in high school biology or whatever would be familiar to you in this descriptive theory where we recognize patterns, we make predictions on these patterns, we observe and collect data, we compare to known theories, we describe similarities and variances. So when you were, I don't know, in America, we did this with the, dissection of the high school frog, I'm sure, or be my assumption that they let you cut things open in a high school biology class, but this would, the scientific method, propose a hypothesis, observe and collect, so on and so on. Explanatory theories used in scientific and social scientific research by researchers of the type that you regularly research are a little more explanatory than this. Right, so there's an extra step. We recognize patterns, we make predictions, we observe and collect data, we generate explanations, compare to other theories, and revise and review for further, revise and return for further review. This is the scientific process, which is, in principle, works in a similar pattern for social sciences as well as life sciences, biological sciences, etc. So social scientists begin with a research question. Right, we don't formulate research questions randomly, and one of the things that I want you to be able to link or to understand is that social scientists generally situate their research questions within one or more of the paradigms that we looked at in week 1 in terms of functionalism, social conflict theory, or interactionism. Right? Knowing these paradigms allows us to situate our research questions with an understanding of appropriate research methodologies, unit of analysis, and other considerations that go into constructing a proper methodological approach. So, theory formulation has a number of paradigms beyond these kind of just the dominant sociological paradigms. So I mentioned social structural, social conflict, but criminology is not only a sociological enterprise, right? So the larger sphere of criminology can draw from a number of paradigms: cultural theories, trait theories, which we'll look at next week, biological and psychological explanations of crime. You would look at many of these in your psychology of crime course. Choice theories, right, which underlie contemporary rational choice perspectives, as well as things like situational crime prevention. Interactionist theories, which is a paradigm that we've looked at, and so on. These are all crime paradigms in a sense, and that they are larger than individual theories, but they group theories that have similar assumptions. So this brings us back to Ritzer's integrative macro-micro theory of social analysis that I said in week 1. I told you we would come back to this because for me it's very useful to be able to use this to plot these different crime paradigms in terms of their assumptions related to their level of analysis. Are they macroscopic or microscopic? Macroscopic means they tend to look at things on a large social level, large groups in society, or even in some cases society itself. Microscopic, we're looking at individual or small group level. An objective, do they make knowledge claims about being able to make definitive statements about social reality? This tends to be more positivistic. Or are they subjective? Are they interested in people's perceptions, beliefs, or the various facets of the social construction of reality? So social structural theories, such as those proposed by Durkheim and followed through by functionalist research, and I think that I gave the example, let's say we wanted to look at the correlation between educational attainment and likelihood of criminal offending over the life course. We could, pull a sample, look at, people's variety of educational outcomes, who finishes high school, who goes to university, who goes on to postgraduate study, and we could cross those with their criminal career histories, maybe even look at some self-report data, going back to what we talked about last week. This is a very positivistic or post-positivistic view of research where we would be looking at making objective statements about the social world. Right? So it's far more towards the objective end of the axis here than the subjective. But we would be looking at a smaller substrata. We're looking at groups. So we're using education and criminal offending. So it's not totally macroscopic. It's not totally microscopic. It's somewhere in what sociologists would call the middle range. Trait theories, highly individualistic, right? So we see them much more towards the microscopic and much more towards the objective, as we'll talk about next week. Right? Trait theories are biological and or psychological theories that look at the particular manifestations of pathology or difference on individual levels to explain involvement in serious deviant or criminal behavior. Social conflict theories, as we mentioned, tend to be situated in this middle range as well, but they're not quite as positivistic. Right? Many social conflict theories, as we've looked at, take issue with the construction of knowledge. Okay? So there is maybe a critique on whether or not official offending data is an accurate reflection of the total number of offender types, demographically, age, gender, in terms of things like drug use, etc. So we would expect to see this, again, in this middle range, but not quite making the same objective knowledge claims, always focusing on the fact that there are relationships of power in terms of the construction of knowledge. Who gets to say what is criminal or not criminal? Who gets to decide what populations to police, whom to arrest, things of this nature. Life course theories, which we'll look at briefly towards the end. Life course theories are situated for those of you that have looked at these in other classes for obvious reasons, fairly squarely in the middle, because they take or they attempt to link macro and micro theories. So they use some aspects of labeling theory, for example, but also aspects of trait theories, also aspects of things like educational attainment, social class of parents, etc., in order to both measure and accurately predict offending over the life course. Cultural theories, which we'll look at in week 12, cultural theories highlight the role that culture plays or subculture play in things like involvement in deviant activity, criminal careers, etc. So this tends to be more towards the subjective end, right? Interested in people's perceptions or beliefs. Why do certain groups or subgroups have such antipathy towards law enforcement, for example? How do they construct reality in a way where being bad is actually good? Way down the road in week 12, we're going to read a great chapter by a guy named Jack Katz in a book called Seductions of Crime, called Ways of the Badass, where he looks at the phenomenology of what it means to learn to become bad. In some ways, the chapter is quite amusing. In some ways, it's quite serious because he really highlights the way in which these are learned social behaviors. So cultural theories, put people's perceptions, their phenomenology of daily experience at the foreground in terms of explaining why some people and not other people, for example, might become involved in more serious or violent offending. Choice theories, which we'll look at a little bit today, and certainly in greater detail towards the end of the term when we refer back to right realism. Choice theories tend to be highly individualistic. They look at the motives of individual actors within rational decision-making contexts. So we tend to see them more on the microscopic or in between the microscopic and macroscopic when we think of them in an environmental context, right? The individual in relationship to his and her or environment, where their view of the cost-benefit of offending is the primary focus here, right? So choice theories are interested in the way that people subjectively calculate risk versus reward to make such decisions. Interactionist theories tend to be, as we looked at things like labeling theories, more towards the subjective end, very much interested in the social construction of reality, how people internalize those labels or those views of others in ways that they in turn react to. We'll go back to Bloomer's threefold definition of symbolic interactionism, the interactive process. In week one, we can see why interactionist theories tend to fall on the more subjective end of this axis. So all these theories aren't better or worse. This is one of the things I want you to understand. All these theories depend really in terms of where we're starting our research question from. Are we interested in micro-level questions? You know, why, for example, we're interested in, you know, why is there an increase in suicide among young people in Australia? We would want to begin with a hypothesis. Does it have to do with increase in mental health, you know, bullying? You know, there are a variety of hypotheses. And once we had some sense of what we wanted to ask, we could go back to this chart and we could say, well, where does, you know, these different theories or approaches, where do they lay in terms of our assumptions about the hypothesis? Are the causes more macroscopic or microscopic? And out of this, we could formulate hypotheses or other research proposals that would, you know, look at how to collect data, how to observe that data, and then how to begin to work that chart of knowledge production in a way that allows us to eventually come to some sense of being able to test or understand or verify the accuracy, the reliability, our findings, and so on. So here's an example, right? If we were going to do a research study, and we can use choice theory as a example as our template here. Choice theories begin with some very basic propositions, mainly that crime is not random but patterned, right? See step one for this. Most crimes can be explained by the perceived reward versus the calculated risk on the part of the offender. Okay, so here we have our theories of crime causations in terms of we want to recognize a pattern, and then we want to make a prediction out of that pattern. An example of this would be the lottery. Okay? So we know that millions of people play the lottery, right? Millions of these people perceive possible reward, which is huge, as worth a small risk. Okay? We're not talking about criminal behavior here, but rather financial risk. But poor communities, research tells us, actually spend relatively more income on this risk than richer ones do. And if we want to go back and we wanted to ask a question of why this is, if we were to begin from a choice theory perspective, if we assumed that most people playing the lottery are, you know, they're adults by definition, they're buying lottery tickets. They are playing, most people that are making the choice, you know, of sound mind, making a decision to spend a certain amount of their income on an anticipated or a hopeful gain, right? We recognize this pattern, first of all. The pattern is that we look at the data, and the data tells us by and large people in poorer communities tend to spend more of their income than people in wealthier communities on lottery. We make a prediction, right? Crime is a result of perceived benefit or reward, or in this case, we're not talking about crime, but lottery purchasing as a result of perceived benefit versus risk, right? Millions of people perceive this reward, which is huge, is worth a small risk. However, poor communities spend relatively more of their income on risk than richer ones do. And we wanted to study why this is. We would find that the data shows and choice theorists suggest that this is because the perceived reward is greater for those who have less money. For those who are fairly wealthy, the reward would have to be much greater, and the perception of the likelihood of that reward lessens relative to how much money or how much wealth they might already have. So the perceived reward becomes greater for those who have less, and from a rational choice perspective, remember, we're talking rational choice is always from the perspective of the social actor. I think it often gets confused that there's a rationality out there that everybody adheres to. Now, rational choice theory looks at how people weigh up the benefits and the risks, or reward versus risk, from their own perception. So out of this then, if we wanted to continue our circle, we could identify a pattern, make a prediction, formulate a hypothesis, and then go and see, whether, and decide on the appropriate methodology. We might use a survey, might use interviews. There's a variety of methodologies that would allow us to verify whether or not it is in fact the case that the reason why poor people spend tends to be the difference in the perception versus risk and reward, and so on. Anyway, this first part of the lecture, or part one, is really just to give you a sense of the beginning of theory formulation. We'll talk about differences or examples of theory formulation in many of the different approaches that we look at. But in this case, we'll stop here and begin to move on in the next lecture to classical criminology, which, as I mentioned in lecture one, was really the first, at least in the West, modern attempt to explain crime as something other than a result of the push and pull of larger cosmological forces. And it fits quite well into our discussion of rational choice. So we'll end here and pick up on the second part of week 3.